everyone. Welcome to session 2 of this season's Women on the Move. And as always, thank you to the Samuel I. Newhouse Foundation for their sponsorship of this series. I'm Marjorie Schuster, coordinator of literary events here at the Temple Emanu-El Streicker Center. Today's author is someone whose books I have always enjoyed, and I am so thrilled that she is here with us. Since her debut in 1997, Laura Lippman has been recognized as one of the most gifted and versatile crime novelists working today. Her series featuring her heroine, Tess Monahan, her standalone books, and her short stories have all won major awards, including the Edgar and the Anthony, and her work is published in more than 20 countries. A former Baltimore Sun journalist, she's also written for the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, Washington Post, Oprah Magazine, and others. I believe it's 26 books over the last 25 years. We are here today to talk about her latest book, Seasonal Work, a compilation of brilliantly crafted short stories and a lot of fun to read. It is my pleasure to welcome Laura. Hello, Laura.
It's my pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me, Marjorie.
Good. Well, we're very thrilled you're here. We have a lot to talk about. The first thing I want to talk about in Lane is this fabulous book. Can you share a little bit with us? Tell us a little bit about it. How did these stories come together?
So I can't speak for everyone, but as a crime novelist, the way that I end up writing short stories, which are really labor intensive, like it's hard to say yes because a short story takes so long relative to how much I could do on a novel in that same time period that I don't generally do it unless someone asks me to. And even then I have to think about it. I'll be like, okay. And it's almost always someone reaches out and says, the topic is this, can you write a story? And if the topic interests me, I will usually say yes. And if the person asking is a good friend, I will often say yes. So this is my second collection of short stories. And these stories were written, I believe, from 2007 through 2019. And then there was a brand new story at the end that was written just for this collection, written at the end of 2020, early 2021. And I know that in a way that might sound kind of mechanical to be like, oh, just tell me the topic and I'll write it. But I also teach writing, and that's very similar to an exercise I do all the time, which is a prompt. And students come into class and I'll usually have them write for 15 to 20 minutes. And really good stuff comes out of prompts. So I don't find it to be antithetical at all to creation. I know a lot of people think that creation should just come from within and you listen to your muse and why would you possibly just write to contract? But actually some of the writers I admire most in my field were hardworking people who took work wherever they could find it. So in a way, when I take a short story assignment, I feel like I'm channeling someone like Donald Westlake or, Ed McBain, people who were very focused on this is my job and this is what I do. And I will take opportunities to do it where they come. So that all these stories were just suggested by someone else's external prompt.
Interesting. How did you pick these stories? Were there other stories sitting there in your vault?
There are only a couple of others. I went through and I picked the stories that I felt I could organize in some sense. The book does it has specific sections. I looked for themes in my own work. And I noticed that, first of all, there's a whole Baltimore, Tess Monahan, my recurring character. Anything that spoke to that became one section. I found that I'd written a lot about girls, people in their teens or even preteens. So I looked at those stories. And then finally, I found that there was this whole thread about adultery and infidelity that I'd written about over the years. And that became the third section of the book.
Right. So let's talk a little bit about girls. Yes, because first of all, you speak a lot about women and girls and they're evil, or maybe that's not the right word, but they do things I didn't expect. Right?
Yeah, definitely. My work is really female centric.
Yes.
And I think that started off just by accident, but now it's very much by design. I think I have something to say about females. And I think that when I'm writing about females, that's my bailiwick. Am I using that word correctly? I remember I'm friends with a lot of crime writers, and I came up at the same time as Harlan Coben, Dennis Lehane. And I remember reading Mystic River and thinking, okay, I can't write a better book about young men. I mean, like, I'm never going to be able to write about young men the way that Dennis Lehane can write about young men. It's like, but I think I can write about young women in a way that a lot of my colleagues cannot. And there's a group of us. It's hard to say where it starts. I mean, it's actually, you can go way back into the history of literature to find other women who are writing about women in an interesting, unexpected way. But definitely over the last 10 to 15 years, there was Gillian Flynn with Gone Girl, which felt incredibly fresh when it came along, but was building on Gillian's other work, which was also dark and unexpected. You have Megan Abbott, who's an amazing writer and has been writing about adolescent girls in a way that other people don't. It's so interesting to me. I watched Yellow Jackets on Showtime and became hooked on it like a lot of people. But the thing that I found so interesting around that cultural conversation is that this felt so new to people. They're like, oh, I've never seen a TV show like this about teenage girls. It was like, heck, y'all missed it, because there was a really good one called Dare Me that I think it ended up on Netflix. I think it started off on FX, or it might have been on USA, but that was based on Megan Abbott's books about cheerleaders. And she worked on it, and she was, a big part of the writer's room. So yeah, there's been a little group of us who've been pushing the envelope on girls and teenagers and women for a while now.
So prior to that, I think you felt girls were like underrepresented in crime literature.
I think that they were often used almost as MacGuffins. It's like, oh, there's a dead female body. What is a guy going to do about it? I like to joke, except it's not quite as much of a joke as I wish it were, that there was a long time where a lot of even the best crime fiction, prize-winning crime fiction, could be reduced to a beautiful woman dies and a man feels bad about it. And this could be the story of an investigator. This could be the story of the killer. This could be the story of someone who is connected to the beautiful girl. It could be the person who is accused of killing her. But it was so often that the women were relegated to these roles of victim or support staff. I happened, for the most random reason, to pick up a copy of Mickey Spillane's I, the Jury the other day. And, the way that Mike Hammer talks and thinks about women, I mean, I get it. They're classics. They're important. They were seminal. They influenced a lot of men I know coming up. I don't know a lot of women who really found much to hold on to in Mickey Spillane.
That's funny. So do you have a favorite character amongst all these women that you spoke about in this book?
Well, Tess Monahan is first in my heart. She's the first character I created. She is almost like my little sister. We share a lot. We don't share everything. We're not the same in every way, but we agree on a lot. We agree on the important things. She has less impulse control than I do. She's braver than I am probably too. But she'll always, have the first position among the other. Well, I guess I love them all, ultimately. I mean, I love the young girl who's in the title story, Seasonal Work. And I love Tess Monahan's mom. And I had fun writing a story that helped me understand her better. And I particularly love the school teacher in Slow Burner. Not for what she does, which is, questionable, but I loved writing a story about a woman who was very conscious that she wanted to be the main character in her own life. And that story has a lot of Greek mythology in it, and it puzzles over some things in Greek mythology that I've always puzzled over, to wit, the relationship between Zeus and Hera, and how many other people had to suffer because of their dysfunctional relationship. I mean, it's kind of crazy when you think about it, and that it's enshrined at sort of the heart of a mythology / religion, which is the idea that here are the two most powerful people and they just make each other miserable. Okay, fine. I think we all know people like that. And then they make so many people around them miserable. And that's much harder to justify. So I did love writing Slow Burner, but yeah, they're I love them all. They're all my creations.
I understand. I do want to talk about the seasonal work, the title chapter. Can we talk about it? Give a little bit away, maybe not the very end.
I don't think you have to give that much away. It's told from the point of a teenage girl whose family at first just appears to be spectacularly unlucky. It's a father and 4 kids. But really, the family's got a grift going. They've got a grift that works at holiday time. They've realized that if you can get local media coverage as a needy family that something horrible has happened to, that you will probably be inundated with gifts and cash. I was a reporter for a long time, 20 years, and this is just factual. I have written about families in need at the holidays, and I have seen other stories about families in need, and I know how a community responds. And in fact, very early in my career, my boss wrote about a family in need, and the next day I was the one who was assigned on Christmas Day to go to their house and write about how the community had given them the Christmas that had been stolen from them. And I always believed it was a grift. I mean, I didn't have any proof. I certainly, as a young I would have been a 22-year-old reporter at the time. I wasn't going to try to call it out. And I certainly wasn't going to suggest to my boss that he'd been taken in by someone. But I always believed it was a hoax.
It's a great story. Well, I wish we could talk about the end because it's we'll let everyone read it, but it was excellent. But I could see that being expanded. I could see that as a full book, or I could see that as a TV show.
Possibly. I mean, that story, yes. Some of the other stories, no. For the most part, when I'm writing outside of my series, whether it's a short story or a novel, I don't come back to people. Sometimes people and events come back in a very minor background kind of way, because that would make sense. My last novel, Dream Girl, Tess Monahan showed up, but she's not the main character. She's there only for a chapter. In Lady in the Lake, Maddie Schwartz becomes friends with Tess Monahan's not yet mother, with a very young Judith Weinstein. So in my head, I'm writing this one Baltimore, I guess, or this one world. And some of my characters sometimes bump into each other. You know, I haven't yet gone back to a story and said, oh, I need to do more. Although in the case of a story in the book, 5 Fires, that was commissioned, you know, the great wild west of the internet. I can't even remember anymore the name of the publication that originally commissioned it. And it got bought, it got sold, it got crazier and crazier. But I was asked to write a story, and I could write about anything in this case. And I wrote this story called 5 Fires, and it was inspired by a real life story that happened in the Midwest that did involve a case of popular athletes being accused of rape. And I was caught on the detail of the people who had supported the athletes and the girls in particular who had been so vicious about the victim. And so I wrote this story, 5 Fires, and then a couple of years later, maybe 5 years later, time is a very fuzzy concept to me, I found myself going back to that same small town and writing a story that took place before the events of 5 Fires, and that became Sunburn. And I was just like, oh, wow, for the little town in Delaware, this town certainly has an issue with arson and fires happening in strange ways. And so I saw them as connected, although there's never any reference in the novel to the story. couldn't be because the novel took place before the story.
Makes sense. You see, when I read that, I thought maybe you were Tess. That's not correct. And how did you come up with her, of course?
So I was working at the Evening Sun. It was the early 1990s. And for the first time ever, the publisher of the Baltimore Sun talked about the fact that there might have to be layoffs. It would be years before that actually happened, but it was a huge deal at the time. I mean, it just had never happened. There had never been layoffs at the Sun. And I was 5 from the bottom on the seniority list. If there were to have been layoffs, I would have certainly been affected. And I realized that there I was 30 years old, give or take. And I had no idea what I would do if I wasn't a journalist. I didn't have any other skills. I had a coworker who's really good, wonderful guy, sat next to me. And he had mentioned one time in passing that a private investigator had said that he would hire him, an insurance company said they would hire him as an investigator if he ever wanted to do that. So I thought, well, I don't know what I'm going to do if I lose my job. So I think I'm going to start writing these stories about a journalist who did lose her job and became what I would call the accidental private detective, with echoes of Ann Tyler in there, because if you're a writer in Baltimore, Ann Tyler casts this really long, big shadow, and that's where Tess came from. And so, yeah, we had a lot in common, except she's the what if version of me. It's like, what if I had lost my job? What if I had become a private detective? What would have happened next? And so that was where the Tess Monahan series came from. And it followed her. I used to say, someone once called it Chicklet with guns. And I think they meant that as an insult. They was like, no, that's very much what it is, because it was always in my head that while these were traditional PI stories, they were also stories about a young woman making her way into the world. And you watch Tess go from being an absolute amateur to being someone who gradually gets better and better at her job until she has her own office. I mean, Tess has a partner now. Tess has hired an ex-cop to work with her, and she's very, very good at what she does now. She does not make a lot of mistakes anymore. And that's part of the reason that Tess has not appeared in a novel or short story of her own for many years now, is that she had a kid, and writing suspenseful stories about a young mom, it's really tricky. It's really hard to do. I've managed it once, but it's a hard balancing act, and I haven't figured my way back in.
Because you don't want anything to happen to your beloved Tess and she's a mommy now.
And I also think readers would not be very forgiving of some of the decisions she would have to make the story interesting. Yeah. All of a sudden, a woman putting herself in peril when she has a young kid at home. I don't want to read that book unless you can convince me on some level that she absolutely has to do that. There's a lot of discussion in my field about children in jeopardy. Sometimes they reduce that to child jep. And I have certainly written stories in which children are in jeopardy. I've written stories in which bad things happen to kids, absolutely. But I don't, as a reader, it's really hard for me to read a story about a protagonist who's making bad decisions for her family. I mean, I know what my own reading is like. I could read a novel about a bad mom. I'm sure I have. But if it's a character that you're supposed to root for and she's making terrible decisions about her kids, I don't know. It's a tough one. I do hope I get back to Tess, but I haven't figured it out yet.
Well, then, since we're talking about Tess, let's talk a little bit about, well, first of all, it's obvious you love bookstores, books, libraries. We all do. So tell us about the book thing in Baltimore, and let's talk about that a little bit.
So that was a story that was commissioned by the Mysterious Bookshop in New York. They did a collection of book-themed stories. And my sister worked in a lot of Baltimore bookstores. She worked at some independents, and she worked at Barnes & Noble when it was on the Johns Hopkins campus, and then when it became like the neighborhood store at large. So I knew a lot about the book business. and I knew about it from sort of every angle. And of course, as a writer, I had so many friends, the people who ran Mystery Love's company in Baltimore. It's moved to the Eastern Shore. So many independent mystery bookstore owners were huge supporters of mine. So I knew a lot about the business and its challenges. And I really wanted to write a story. First of all, it's so exciting for me when I write a story where I don't kill anybody. It's kind of a break for me. I mean, I like that. I like showing that I don't have to murder someone in order to have something to write about. And I do think a lot about books as physical objects. At the time I wrote that story, there was a small but extremely loud group of people who were swearing up and down that physical books were going to disappear, that publishing as we knew it was going to cease forever, that everything was going to be digital, everybody was going to be an independent contractor. And they were saying that that would be better for everybody. There was a lot of talk about what people called gatekeepers in publishing. And we're talking the early teens, and everyone may have noticed that none of this came to pass. There are probably more self-published people. They tend to call themselves indie writers. I don't really get that nomenclature. I mean, I think self-publishing is not something that people need to rebrand. That it's interesting to me that people want to self-publish but call it something else as if self-publishing is distasteful. It's not. I mean, it's not for me because I don't want to do all the extra work of marketing and selling my books. I just want to write my books.
You don't need to.
I don't need to now. I mean, I had to, I toured myself in my first 5 years. I had a friend, Sujata Massey, who's a wonderful writer, still writing amazing books. And we put ourselves in the car and we drove to a lot of places. We drove to a lot of places all over the Northeast. We went to conferences together. So I did do that for a while. I don't want to do it anymore if I can avoid it. But at any rate, there was this whole discussion, and people would make fun of people they still make fun of people who say that they like physical books. And I don't get that. I mean, I read both. I read digital books. I read physical books. The books that I read on digital tend to be books that I want right now, like right this minute. I want this book and I want to read it. And I'm not even going to wait to drive to a local store to see if it's in stock. And I'm definitely not going to wait 48 hours for the store to order it for me. Baltimore has a great, thriving independent bookstore market right now, and I support them all and I love them all. So, for example, I've been keeping really close records of my reading in 2022 because I'd made a pledge to read only for pleasure in 2022. I just read what I want to read. I'm not reading for blurbing it's just like I read books that I want to read when I want to read them. And so in the past 2 weeks, I read a wonderful book called Mouth to Mouth. I read that digitally because I wanted to get it the minute I heard about it. I'm reading a physical copy. Anyway, this is like off on a tangent. I love books. I love what they are. I love holding them in my hand. I think that the physical book is actually an amazing format that doesn't age out very well. But at the same time, I think we can be too precious about books. And I am someone who used to collect first editions. And now I don't know why I did that. It's like, why would you have a book that you can't take off the shelf and read? It's like, that seems, and I also know that people get mad on the internet if someone takes a book and cuts it up to make art. And it's like, yeah, I mean, except what if it's a book that I'm so interested in these ideas. And truthfully, I have taken some old books and broken them up and used their pages to create framed pictures. Or you find these really cool old paperbacks. And, in the case of an old copy of Shirley Jackson's The Lottery, I took the cover off and framed it because it was just so different and interesting. So I wanted to write about all of those ideas about who really respects books, what is a book worth? At the end of the day, is it about the physical object and cherishing the physical object, or is it about what's inside? And there's a moment in that story when there's an allusion to a children's book that's not spelled out, in which a character says it's not the book that matters, it's what's inside the book. And the character is specifically talking about the Bible. And that comes from a beloved children's book, The Long Secret by Louise Fitzhugh, the sequel to Harriet the Spy. That's an actual conversation. So my mom was a children's librarian. My sister was a bookseller. The life of a book as a physical object is very, very interesting to me.
Interesting. Well, we're going to get back to seasonal work, but I've been very excited to talk about another one of your books. Probably one of my favorite books that you wrote is Lady in the Lake. I think that was 1 book ago. And one of the reasons is because I have read that you're a huge Marjorie Morningstar fan. Is that correct?
Absolutely correct. I reread it every year.
Okay. So I also read it every year. I've been reading it every year since I'm about 16. So I know every word of that book. So when your book came out, I was very excited to read about those characters. So tell me why. Did you feel that Marjorie Morningstar really wasn't happy she really wanted to fulfill her destiny of being somebody?
No, I didn't feel that way. I feel that Marjorie Morningstar as written is exactly the book that Herman Wouk intended, and that no one should question the happiness or fulfillment that Marjorie finds in her marriage to Milton Schwartz. But there were two things I was struck by when I was rereading it in 2017. It had to be 2017. I'm kind of doing the book appeared in 2019, so I have to have it underway well into 2017. The first is that I had never noticed in all the times I read the book, it's depending on what version you read, it's 600 to 700 pages, right? And all but like 4 of those pages are told in the close third person of Marjorie and done really well. It's about a woman, and it's about her making her way through life at a time when certain decisions were really fraught. And having done that beautifully for all these pages, at the end of the book, Wouk turns it over to Wally Ronkin, the boy who yearned for Marjorie, never really got close to having her, got to kiss her once, but she was never interested in
the Botanical Gardens, I think.
Yes, the kiss under at the cloisters.
Thank you.
The kiss under the lilacs in the cloisters. I've actually taken my daughter there. It's like, this is an important place. This is where Wally and Marjorie went. At any rate, I was rereading it, and there's this whole passage about Wally, who's become a successful, kind of hacky playwright, sees Marjorie for the first time in 20 years, almost 20 years. And he's like, oh, wow. And she's like a couple years older than he is. He's like, I'm so glad she never took me up on my infatuation with her. She looks like a grandmother. She's definitely too old for me. She's 39 years old. And I had never picked up on that, how young she is. I'm like, 39 is nothing. And so I noticed that. And then I just thought in general about how these very slight, not particularly meaningful brushes with our past I don't think in Marjorie Morningstar this happens, but now I'm in an alternative universe where it's like, what if seeing Wally did make her think about all the things she thought she was going to be? An actress, she clearly thought she was going to be happily married to Noel, that she was going to have a very different, sophisticated, urban life, that she was always saying, I'm not going to be another mama from the suburbs. And she ended up as a mama from the suburbs. And I just wanted to explore the idea that a chance encounter with someone from our past could result in this introspection of, I am not who I said I was going to be. I'm nowhere close. And in my book, Marjorie's on the verge of becoming an empty nester. She's still really young. And it's also, and this is really crucial to me, it's also 1966 or late 1965 when this starts. I'm really interested in those few years between the Kennedy assassination and 1968. There's change going on, but it's not as dramatic. It's not the stuff we talk about. When we talk about the 60s, we tend to talk about the Kennedy assassination and what changed and the end of optimism. And then we talk about Woodstock and the war in Vietnam and student, it's like, and then it's like, well, what was happening in 1966? And I chose that year in part because we had just gone through this presidential election in 2016. Y'all might remember it. And there were these weird parallels with the governor's race in Maryland in 66, where a political outsider managed to become the major party nominee, was clearly doing some race baiting. There was definitely a dog whistle. I mean, he ran on this platform of every man's home is castle, which was basically an endorsement of segregation. And the thing is that this candidate was the Democratic Party nominee in Maryland. And the person he ran against, who ended up winning because Black voters simply could not vote for this racist Democrat, was Spiro Agnew. And so when I started, I was super interested in the election, which became such a footnote at Lady in the Lake. And I mean, I'm glad you asked me about Lady in the Lake, because I have some of my best writing memories are with Lady in the Lake. It was like a happy book to work on because I did a lot of crazy stuff that I hadn't done before and I really haven't done since, which is, it's not just about Maddie Schwartz. In some ways, it's a very meta novel about here's this privileged white woman who's going to write about the death of a Black woman and make her name that way. I mean, that's what Maddie does, is she sets out to write about the death of a Black woman that hasn't received a lot of attention because, it's Baltimore in the 1960s. And then so I added Cleo, the dead woman, but she's speaking to us from beyond the grave. She's a ghost. Like, and then all of a sudden I was like, what if in this book, because this is a book about incuriosity or about being so focused on a single goal that you don't see other things around you. Here you have Maddie Schwartz, who's trying to prove that she could be a good human interest reporter at the newspaper where she's gotten a clerical position, and she's just barreling her way through her life. And everywhere she goes, she's meeting people who have these amazing, interesting stories, except she never thinks to ask them a single question about themselves. So you have these, I think there are 18 individual monologues from various people that she comes into contact with, whether it's one of her coworkers at the newspaper, whether it's the young up-and-coming Baltimore Oriole, Paul Blair, a real person, whether it was the first female homicide cop in Baltimore, also a real person, a waitress in a diner, a man who works for a state, it's just, there are all these people who have stories all around her. And when I was working on it, and my editor had only seen like part of it, she's like, what is going on here? She's like, what are these voices? I was like, just trust me. I think when it's all together, you'll see it. It is almost like they become a chorus of people, and they represent so much of what's going on in Baltimore in 1966. And it was such a pleasure to write that book. And it became I think it might be my most successful book, depending on what kind of metrics you use. It was very well reviewed. I mean, Stephen King reviewed it for the New York Times Book Review, which is like such a high. And it is, now in pre-production in Baltimore as an Apple TV series. I mean, it's a limited series. That's the term I was searching for. It's only supposed to be one season, although the people who bought it have a really intriguing idea about how they could go further with it if that were to be the case.
That's fabulous. Can you tell everyone who's in it, or is it?
Yes. Natalie Portman is going to play Maddie, and Lupita Nyong'o is going to play Cleo. Those are the two. I mean, it's pretty crazy. And I'm just so happy that they're filming in Baltimore, which was not a decision that I could influence. I'm very hands off when my stuff moves to Hollywood. I've had a lot of stuff optioned. I've only had one other thing made so far. There are other options out there. And I always say to every person who buys my stuff, I was like, I can be as involved as you want me to, up to the point of sort of consultancy. I'm not in a position where I can be in a writer's room for a lot of reasons. And I'm temperamentally not well suited to it. It's not my form. I don't know how to write a screenplay, and I haven't felt much yearning to learn. But I'm excited for this because it creates interest and it can bring new readers, and it's so interesting to see how it has to be reinvented for a visual medium. It's a completely different kind of storytelling.
You'll be okay if they change your characters a little bit?
Oh, they can do whatever they want. They paid me, and also they need to. I think it's really interesting to think about. If you've ever seen certain beloved text adapted with absolute fidelity, they tend to be kind of inert. They don't tend to be very good. I don't like to name names when I'm talking about things I don't like very much, but yeah, I'm not going to name that name. I have definitely seen some adaptations that were absolutely loyal to the source material to a fault. And I keep that in mind. It's just different. And you have to figure out how to honor what you love in the story. It's much more about the soul of the story than it is about the literal facts. And there have been some changes I've seen in the scripts, and I think that's interesting. I don't know why they're doing it, but they know why they're doing it, and that's all that matters.
We had Jean have Corlitz not too long ago, and she was telling us about when she wrote "You Should Have Known," and then they, of course, made it The Undoing. Right. She had to watch it to find out kind of who did it at the end. It was so completely different than what she had, come up with, but interesting. Well, and how did you pick all the names? You didn't use Marjorie, my name. You went with Maddie. It's like Milton Schwartz I kept. How did I pick? Maddie.
Close enough. Madeline is my mother's name.
Oh, okay.
And was also her aunt's name, and it's my middle name. And I mentioned before my interest in the 60s, and I think I'm particularly interested in people who are from that generation where they were just that much too old to be part of the kind of youth upheavals of the 60s. They had to kind of sit it out on the sidelines because they already had kids. But one of the things I put in the book is that Maddie is very interested in clothing and fashion, and she's noticing that there are these new beautiful prints by the designer Mary Mecco. And my mom was someone who wore Mary Mecco in the 60s. And there's a reference to Betty Cook jewelry. And Betty Cook Betty's still with us in her 90s. Betty was part of this young artist scene in Baltimore at the time, creating this it's still beautiful. She's still creating beautiful things. So, that's where Maddie came from. Names are hard for me. They're hard enough for me to create, and then to remember how they came to be is hard, because at some point my characters become pretty real to me. Not in I have trouble distinguishing between life and fiction way, but they just become kind of full-bodied characters, and their biographies are their biographies, and they seem kind of real to me. I stop experiencing them as my creation. I'm just like, yeah, that's who they are. That's what their name is. I don't know. And some of the names predated the book, because characters like Judith and her brother Donald existed before this book began. Trying to think if there are any others.
Well, you used a Seth in that book.
Yeah, I don't know. I have no idea where this stuff comes from.
That he was Ferdy Plack. Well, at another time, we'll probably talk about Marjorie Morningstar. I love when people like to talk about it. Let's see. Let's go back a little bit to seasonal work. I want to talk about Sheila.
Oh, yeah.
Right. See that she's a young girl. It's supposed to be like Sheila the Great, I assume, from Judy Blume.
I would say she's like Sheila the Great. She's very much like Harriet the Spy. I feel like I'm missing one of her antecedents. But that's a story. So that was for a collection, like you had to write a story that had something to do with Sherlock Holmes. And one of my secret shames is I don't really know that much about Sherlock Holmes. I've read like the most famous stories. I have watched very few of the traditional Sherlock Holmes films. So when someone came to me and said, can you write a story that has a connection to Sherlock Holmes? I was like, I can write a story about a kid who wears a deerstalker cap, because I did have a deerstalker cap and I was a snoop. I'm trying to see if it's fair to say that in past tense. Yes, I was a snoop. I'm not a snoop anymore. I know I'm not a snoop anymore because my daughter has a cell phone and I know the code and I never go into it. So I know that I've broken my bad habits of my past.
Very nice.
But I was also interested in that moment that exists in a lot of kids' lives. And this can happen to you when you're way grown up. It can happen to you when you're young. It just depends. But I think every person has a moment when they realize that their parents have a past individually and together, that their parents have this whole life that had absolutely nothing to do with them. And I think that story was influenced in part by a friend who mentioned one time, even though it was like not a big deal and not something anyone ever talked, it was like just a fact, that his wife had been married before they married. You know, she'd been married, she got divorced, they got married. He wasn't, there was no drama to it. But man, when their daughter found out that her mother had been married before, she just could not get past it. She's like, Dad, did you know that mom had been married before? And I thought about that. And I thought about, what it's like if you are a snoop, to try to make sense of the things that you discover and the little, stray facts that you do have about your parents, and how do you interpret those? And then what do you do with them? And
exactly.
What do you do if you figure out that a parent has a particular sadness or regret you really wish you never knew? You don't want to be on the interior of your parents' marriage.
Wow, interesting. So it seems like you must have read a lot as a child. Is that accurate? Did you read Nancy Drew? Let's start with that.
Okay, so not the biggest Nancy Drew fan in the world.
Oh, surprising.
I once wrote about that for the New York. Well, here's my thing. As a reader, my personal preference is, as a reader and a writer, I like my characters smaller than life. I don't like super perfect people. And, in Nancy Drew, Nancy is so perfect. And in case you don't get how perfect she is, Bess and George are there to tell you how perfect she is. I mean, Nancy is like really perfect. She never screws up. She never makes a mistake. I like the Happy Hollisters. I like Trixie Belden. I loved Encyclopedia Brown. Loved Encyclopedia Brown.
She's the best.
And, Sally Kimball is the muscle. So I did read a lot. When I was 10 years old, I read a lot because I was the youngest of two kids in this house full of very bookish people. And to me, books were the gateway to adulthood. Like you would be taken seriously if you were reading a book. And when I was 9 or 10, my mother decided to go to graduate school and get a Master of Library Science and become a children's librarian. And so I sat there with my mother and read my way through every single Newbery Award winner, which I always tell people, it's almost like, I don't know if you'd call it a party trick. I mean, like, I bet I'm the only person in this room who read Gay Neck's Story of a Pigeon, which is one of the Newbery Prize winners. There's some really not great books among the early Newbery winners. But I read every Newbery Prize winner with my mom, and going to the library was huge. We went to the library once a week, and, we could check out as many books as we wanted. I was so amused the other day on social media, on Twitter. Some people got into this whole discussion about YA as a consequence of the book bannings that have been happening. And they're like, we didn't have YA when I was a kid. And I was like, oh my God, folks, YA's been around since the 60s. You so had it when you were a kid. You just didn't know. You didn't recognize it as such. But yeah, I went to the library every week, got a big armful of books out. I came home, and because I was obsessed with the adult world, I also began reading a lot of dirty books on the sly. I was always reading something. I read Lolita when I was 12 years old because I had been told it was a dirty book, which that was a bit disappointing. But I read Peyton Place. I read Jacqueline Suzanne, Rosemary Rogers, Sidney Sheldon. Excuse me?
Harrod Experiment?
I don't think I did know about it. Because there was a film with Don Johnson's in that, right? And but yeah, I was just always I was like a smut detector. I was always looking for really filthy things to read. I always remember that I read an excerpt from Erica Jong's Fear of Flying in Playboy when I was babysitting somewhere. I found the cache of Playboys, and then I'm reading the fiction in Playboy, which really was good fiction. But yeah, big reader. And,
it's
still am. And one of the things the pandemic really took from me for a while was my focus. I was still writing. I mean, I've actually published, I finished Dream Girl in the summer of 2020. I had a book of essays that came out in August of 2020. So those had been finished. And then I had the short stories. So, and I have a novel that I'm working on that I think I'm going to finish by April 1st. So I was able to write. My reading really suffered for a while. And it's part of the reason I'm so determined now to just read for pleasure, to have it only be fun. Which isn't to say that I don't love reading my friends' books as they come along. And I do like blurbing books and helping people out. But when I say I'm reading only for fun now, it means I'm reading without a schedule. Like I have no deadlines in my reading. And that's really important to me right now.
Yeah, that makes sense. So, there have been so many great questions that came in. So let me see what everybody would like to know. Well, first of all, Zippy says, I'm from Baltimore. I love reading Laura's books. So we'll start with that. And then Bruce said, agree about seasonal work. I had read it right down to the final paragraph to pick up that twist. Yeah, of course. Okay, Elaine would like to know when Lady in the Lake is available on Apple TV. Probably you don't.
Oh, they haven't even started filming yet.
We get that. Now we get to the nitty gritty. Sherry would like to know, how long does it take to write a book? You said something about short stories take longer. Tell us a little bit about that.
When I started writing, there was a conventional wisdom that if you wanted to become a full-time crime novelist, you needed to work within a series and you needed to produce a book a year. And so when I started writing, I was writing books at the rate of 11 to 12 months. And in order to do that, because there's a lot of downtime in the production of a book, I would send a book off and I would immediately start the next book while I was awaiting editing. And the book would come back, I'd go through the editing, send it back to. So I did that for a while. Over the past 5 years, since I can afford it, I have my one diva move is I only keep one book in my brain at a time.
Really?
So, yeah. So I can write a book in 12 to 14 months, but then there's a lot of downtime. Like I'm going to send this book off on April 1st, I'm pretty sure. And then I'm not going to have anything to do for a while in terms of writing. I might have to, write something to promote a book, but I won't be trying to write a new book. I won't even be trying to think about it that much. And the book will come back for editing and I'll do the editing and we're now really talking about an almost 16-month to 18-month process, but I'm writing it in 12 to 14. A short story can take up to 6 weeks. So if you think about someone who's writing a novel in 12 to 14 months, then a short story, oh gosh, now I'm trying to do math. But you can see that I could produce a lot in a novel in that time period. So short stories are very unforgiving. You can't have, in my opinion, I mean, obviously this is a high goal to shoot for, and I don't want any bum sentences anywhere in my books, but a novel can recover if it has if it has some bagginess to it, or maybe it has a scene that feels a little bit unnecessary. It won't sink the whole enterprise, but a short story really can't accommodate anything but a very focused, polished, no extraneous words or sentences. You can't, in a short story, I think it's really a flaw if there's like some huge glaring question mark, like, but what about such and such? You can't have tangents and diversions. So I find short stories, really demanding that way. And when I take one on, I'm really conscious of the fact of, is this worth trying to park my novel for however long it's going to take to write this short story? And increasingly, it's hard to say yes. The last short story I said yes to was Slow Burner. It was commissioned by Amazon. And I'm just going to be straight up honest. I had never been offered that much money for a short story before. And I was renovating a room in our house. And I was like, if I write this short story, I can get the good sofa. It's like, so slow. And by the way, and Slow Burner went on to be chosen as a Best American Mystery Story. So I'm like, okay, it's not like I'm a complete hack. I really threw my heart and soul into it. But I got to admit, it was like when I heard what they were offering me. And then just one more thing, the story that winds up the collection, that was written for the collection. And, that took like 2 months, in part because that story depends on an extremely factual and meticulous recreation of watching episodes of Columbo in order. And I had to have the calendar just right. If you watched one Columbo a day, starting in spring of 2020, I had to know exactly which Columbo you'd be watching on which day and when you would finish.
Wow. And so that's basically your pandemic couple. Yeah, they weren't very nice.
No, there are not a lot of nice people in my books. That's, the downside.
Well, I like Tess and her mom. So let me see what else people are asking. Well, we have a lot of wonderful comments. Helene would like to know, how do you feel about audiobooks or your books?
I think audiobooks are fantastic. I don't listen to fiction on audiobooks because for some reason they're hard for me to process. What I love on audiobooks are kind of anecdotal nonfiction. Bill Bryson is my absolute go-to on audiobooks, especially if he's reading himself. And his book, One Summer, I've probably listened to it multiple times. It makes me a little blue to say this because he was someone I knew, although not well. He was more good friends with my spouse. Tony Bourdain's Kitchen Confidential is a wonderful audiobook, and I've re-listened to it since his death because it's just nice to have his voice in my ear again. Those are the kind of books I choose for audiobooks. And also, this is going to sound crazy, I love listening to Beverly Cleary's Ramona books on audio. They were read by Stockard Channing. She does an amazing job. I sincerely, no exaggeration, believe that Ramona Quimby in the children's books by Beverly Cleary is one of our greatest literary characters. I mean, she is up there with Emma Bovary as far as I'm concerned. That is one of the greatest characters ever created. Still upset about the New York Times obituary for Beverly Cleary that was rude about Ramona. Wrote about her in a way we'd never write about a little boy who was mischievous and curious and got into lots of scrapes. So yeah, audiobooks are fantastic. And by the way, as a writer, I love audiobooks. The seasonal work was so much fun because we picked different readers and I got to listen to everyone. The best experience I've had with a reader is the reader for Lady in the Lake, Jason Culp, who was so detail oriented. He caught a couple of flaws in the book that we were able to fix before it was published. He asked me the best questions. It was just a great collaboration. So I really appreciate the fact that audiobook is the format that works for so many people right now. And I think it's fantastic. I'm glad that it's another way for people to experience reading.
Good. Well, this is actually a very funny question that came in, and I think you'll understand that I do, certainly. Dee Dee asked, are you okay now to make popcorn in the microwave?
No, don't make your popcorn in the microwave, people.
We'll tell them.
I wrote about this for the New York Times. I wrote a letter of recommendation column about my double boiler, which was, in essence, really about my dad. And my dad taught me how to make perfect popcorn. And I do, in fact, make perfect popcorn. If people follow me on Twitter, about once every 3 months or so, I'll show the pan and the bowl, not a single seed unpopped, and just like, your periodic reminder that I'm a witch. But I make very good stovetop popcorn. It's superior to microwave popcorn. I don't own a microwave in my kitchen in Baltimore. I mentioned to you when we were off air before that my office is being renovated and my office is in a building with a kitchen and it has a microwave. And I'm like, well, what are we going to do with that? I don't because I'm so used to not having one. But no, I'm still making my popcorn on top of the stove and I have no intention of changing.
Wow, I could not be without that. Well, let's see. I guess a few people would just like to know a bit about your writing day, a little bit about that, things like that.
That's cool. I'm very much a morning person, but I also have a kid, which is interesting. I mean, if I didn't have a kid, I would probably get up, walk, grab some coffee, and just start writing. But that's not possible on all days. During the pandemic, walking became really important to me. It started because I try to walk 2 to 3 miles at sunrise every day. Can't do that necessarily if I'm on school duty, which I am 2 to 3 days a week. But whatever happens, at some point, I'm got my laptop open, a cup of coffee beside me, and I will start writing. And I give myself a quota of a minimum of 1,000 words, however long that takes. And sometimes it can happen pretty quickly, sometimes not so much, but the mornings are for writing. And I try to stay focused. I try to stay off of social media. And then afternoons are for email and research or things like that. And then as I get into revision, I do a lot more and the days can go longer. I find revision less exhausting than actual creation. I am really, really close to being finished with a book, which means that by Friday of this week, I will have 80,000 words, give or take, of a complete novel. Because of the way that I work, the first half of it has been drafted at least 4 times at this point, because my writing process, if you've ever heard of a drill in sports called ladders, where you like run to a certain point and run back, and then you run to a farther point and run back, and then you run to a farther point and run back. That's kind of how I write. I write and write and write until I kind of hit a wall. And I'm like, something's wrong. I go back to the beginning and I work my way through and I kind of fix everything. And then I can go a little bit farther and it's like, something's wrong again, back to the beginning. So when I finish and I have this 80,000 words, I'm going to have a manuscript where 60% of it has been revised at least 3 times. And then 20% of it is probably on its second revision. And the final 20% is first draft and needs a ton of work, but I've got time still. So then it'll just be revision until they pry it out of my hands and I give it to my editor.
Well, we don't have time for any more questions, but we had so many additional ones, mostly to tell you how wonderful you are, and people love reading your work and to keep up with it. There's lots and lots of those comments. But I do want to end with one question. Is there anything you wish you were asked, anything you want to tell us? Because I read something that you said something funny once.
Wow, what did I say? I wish I remembered what my clever answer was. I wish I would have loved it if people had asked me about my pandemic coping mechanism of getting dressed up every day. Because that is something I started during the pandemic, inspired by Rachel Sim of New Yorker, who very early in the pandemic suggested that everybody, we were only like 3 weeks in. She's like, everybody on Sunday get dressed up. And I did it. And I found that it made me feel better, made me feel really good. Life is so weird. I've been working from home for so long now. I've been working from home for over 20 years. So for me, there was no novelty or nothing strange about working from home. And I'd been living, kind of in sweats for 20 years. And then it was something like, I'm bored. I'm not going anywhere. I'm going to find time every day to put on nice clothing. And it's become kind of an obsession. I often put the photos up on Twitter, usually with a cut line, if you will, that makes fun of myself on some level. Makes fun of, recently there's been a string of jokes about my affection for the sweater dress, which I do love a good sweater dress. So that's what I would get. What did I say that was funny then?
Something about your husband has the most wonderful wife, something like that.
Oh yeah. Do you want to ask, do you want to ask if my husband's grateful for what an amazing wife is?
That was it. Laura, you're fabulous. You're fun to talk to. Everybody loved listening. Great comments. We love your books.
Thank you.
One of these days, love to have a little private conversation more about Marjorie Morningstar. We'll have to, we'll talk about
love that.
More to catch up on. And it was wonderful. And thank you so much. And I just want to tell everybody who's watching us, next Tuesday, we have Jacqueline Michard right here, and she's terrific, and it'll be great also. Thank you, everybody, for watching.
Thank y'all. And by the way, find me on Twitter if you really need to ask a question. Just to follow me and then just ask me the question and I'll answer it.
Great. Yeah, your Twitter account is funny.
Take care, y'all.
Bye.
Bye.